Hi, welcome to Sky Pilot Faith Quest Podcast. This is, right now, the 199th episode of this podcast. So be sure, stay tuned for next week when we will release, wait for it, the 200th episode. I mean, that's how it works, right? 200 follows 99. We begin this week with an email from someone who was responding to last week's episode. Not only did this person share her own response to last week's material, but she left me wondering why I had not done an episode on what she mentioned before. It's so obvious. So buckle up for the journey ahead as we endeavor to answer the question, is Jesus our template? Welcome to the Sky Pilot Podcast that explores questions of faith, spirituality, and religion. I'm Dan Matthews, and I don't have all the answers, but I do enjoy the questions. Welcome to the podcast where every question is an invitation into a spiritual quest, and you're invited along for the journey. I'm Dan. My little green alien friend here is Quark, and we're your guides for this week's spiritual adventure. So buckle up. It's already time to take off. Okay, just a couple of days ago, I received an email response to, as I said, last week's episode. So let me say this. When I get responses from someone like this, when I get emails about my episodes, they normally fall into three basic categories. One, the person says, I agree with you and your episode really spoke to me. It touched me deeply.
Do you get many of those?
Yeah, I do.
Really?
Look, you don't have to say it that way and sound surprised. And second, yes, I write most of them and send them to myself, but they're really fun to receive. Moving on, the second type of email I receive is someone who says, I disagree with you, and I consider you the lowest kind of heretical vermin. Interestingly, after reading, a number of these, I discovered that very often the person doesn't actually disagree with me. Well, I don't know if they do or they don't, because the truth is, I discover after reading what they have sent me that they haven't watched the video, they haven't listened to the podcast. They're just responding to the point that they think I'm making after reading the title. Don't they know that you can't judge a podcast by its title?
Agreed.
Thanks.
I mean, you have to listen to a podcast to really know how truly terrible it might be.
Yeah, thanks for your support. Okay, moving on to the third and final category. That's someone who, after watching or listening to my episode, had a question. It sparked something for them. They have a question about God. They have a question about faith. They have a question about religion. They have a question about the Bible. I get a fair number of those that they want to ask. And those are fun. I really enjoy them. Yes, I do actually get these. And no, I don't write them myself. But the past week, I received something that fit into none of these three categories. It was a person who wanted to share the way she had experienced a piece of the material that I had put in my previous episode of this podcast. Her name's Anne.
Did you get permission to use her name?
Yeah, of course I did. I asked her.
Oh, good.
Her only stipulation was that if her name gets printed, please make sure that it has an E on it. So, Anne with an E, thanks for your email. So last week, I told a story about my having asked a question on Reddit, and then I gave some of the answers that some of the people who responded to me had sent me. A person who goes by the screen name Nogrith, well, this was part of his reply. Christians are convinced that the first century teacher called Jesus the Nazarene was the perfect human embodiment of God, and that his life should be the template for our own. Now, let's go back to Anne. Basically, she wanted to tell me a story and how that story, her experience in her life, had influenced how she'd heard that passage that I just read to you from Nogrith. So this is the gist of the story, and she and I went back and forth a couple of times so I could get more details from her just to flesh out the story. So a number of years ago, Anne worked in a high-end dining establishment. This is one of those places with high-end clientele, high-end food, high-end service, and high-end prices. And the best way to describe the kind of atmosphere, the physical setting of the restaurant would be,
high-end?
Yeah, perfect. Well said. The chef was talented, impressive, and let's just say intense. And one day in late November, early December, he announced that he was going to dedicate the better part of a couple of days to building a gingerbread house to put on display in the restaurant for the month of December. Now, his intensity meant that not everyone on the staff got along with him. So when looking for volunteer help, it happened to be that our listener was the only one who stepped up. And she said partly because she had recently made a gingerbread house herself on a much, much smaller scale and was eager to learn. So before they got started, the chef said, now, in order to do this successfully, we need a template. Now, that didn't surprise her at all. She'd used a template for hers. She'd gotten herself some graph paper, drawn the exact dimensions of each piece of the gingerbread house. She'd cut out the shape from the graph paper, rolled out the dough, placed the template on top, and cut the dough to shape and size. But his template did all of that, but also went way beyond that. He cut the dough to shape and size, but then created walls out of cardboard that went around the shaped dough. The idea was to make sure that these walls were in place as the dough was baked so that the gingerbread didn't have a chance to deform in any unexpected ways. The template was to make sure that every single piece turned out as expected with little to absolutely no variance or surprises. So here's the interesting part from the email. When she listened to the answer describing Jesus as the template for our lives, that didn't work for her. She actually had a negative reaction to that word. Now, let me be clear. Her email was not a criticism of the podcast material. Instead, she said, well, look, you're always asking for responses, and this is what I thought about as I listened to that episode. So I thought, oh, I'll send it in and share with you, let you know what it made me think about.
That's really nice.
Yeah, it is. So when Nogrith describes Jesus as a template, and with an E, thinks of the image of confining and exacting forms that are designed to make sure that there's no variance, no error, everything turns out according to precise expectations. In other words, the image of template for her implied that Jesus wants us all to turn out the same.
Oh, got it. She didn't like, what is the phrase that you all use that I think would work here rather nicely? Oh, yes, cookie cutter. She didn't like the cookie cutter expectations of Jesus that the word template implied for her.
Yes, nice summary. Now, I should say, I loved this email. And after reading it, I suddenly thought, of course, why haven't I done an episode about this before?
Okay, I'm lost. About templates.
Well, no, not exactly. But talking about templates is the perfect way, the kind of non-threatening way to begin this discussion. There are those of us who hear the description of Jesus as a template and think, that is absolutely perfect. What a great description. And there are people who hear the metaphor and think, sure, that works. It doesn't excite me one way or the other, but it works. And then there are people who find the template image as exclusionary rather than inclusionary.
Like Anne with an E.
Yes. In other words, that particular way of thinking about Jesus doesn't draw them towards him, but makes him instead actually less appealing. Now, before you think to yourself, this is the perfect example of an overly sensitive world where everyone's needs have to be catered to, let me make a point. Every single Christian pastor that I've known, who I respect, any of them who've worth a flip, is aware of this and uses it to some extent, well, I will say frequently, in their own ministry. I'm sure there's some who don't, but the vast majority do. Now, allow me to give you an example. A number of years ago, I was doing some pastoral counseling with a woman who was a member of my congregation. And as we began to talk about her upbringing, she shared with me that she had been repeatedly sexually abused by her father when she was pretty young. At the end of our session, she had some specifics that she wanted me to pray for, and so we bowed our heads to prepare for prayer, and I took a couple of moments of silence to begin to form that prayer in my head, to think about what I would say. And one of the classic ways to start a prayer is to name God, then to describe God. And this is one of those times in which I immediately knew that beginning my prayer with calling God, God the Father, which is very traditional, and then following that with using strongly paternal images to describe God would have been counterproductive destructive to the healing that she needed in this moment. So the point here is actually pretty simple. Christian images, Christian metaphors to describe God or Jesus are not one size fits all. And that can be a very helpful thing to remember. First, you may find yourself at some point asked about your faith, and then when you begin to tell the person about what you believe, they seem almost resistant. No, they seem actually almost hostile. Why would they be unreceptive and hostile when they were the one who asked you? Now, I've had this happen to me. Well, it may be that in that moment, you are describing God in ways that work for you, but you're actually pushing the other person away with the language and the images that you're using as you describe God.
Okay, stop. I have a question. Is it really our job to change the way we speak about God in order to make other people comfortable or to help them understand our faith?
In short, I think absolutely, yes.
Well, of course you do.
Well, I do, but so did Paul.
He did?
Yeah, he did. Remember in Acts 17, Paul's in Athens and notices that the city is filled with temples to all sorts of gods. Then he comes across a shrine of some sort with an altar with an inscription that says it is dedicated to an unknown God. He then says to the people of Athens, let me tell you about a God that is unknown to you, but known to me. He uses imagery, not that works for him personally, but that works for the people to whom he's speaking. He uses the imagery that he feels they are most likely to connect with.
So, the lesson of today is how to be more sensitive when doing evangelism.
Actually, no. I mean, it could be, but no, that's not my primary point here. The point is more about when you talk about your faith with others, it helps to be aware that the imagery that speaks to you may not be positive for the person to whom you are speaking, but may actually be spiritually repugnant, repulsive to them. And I don't think any of us wants to be that person who's turning someone else away from God. But wait, there's more. Equally important, and probably just as useful, is being aware of this when you're on your own journey of spiritual discovery. Because I've frequently encountered people who wanted to seek God, wanted to strengthen their own faith, but went through several communities of faith and felt further and further from God after each one. They felt less close to God than when they'd started. And eventually they discovered this had nothing to do with the actual nature of God, but instead had to do with the way that God was being described and presented to them by the churches that they were a part of. If you find yourself wanting a stronger faith, but increasingly turning away from God, the problem isn't with God or you, it's probably with the metaphors someone else is using to describe God to you. Change your metaphor, and you may find you change your relationship with God. That's all for today. So what do you think? Ever had a metaphor used to describe God that you found didn't work for you, that kind of turned you off? Or perhaps you eventually found one that was different than the one most people use, but really works for you. If you'd like to share either of those with me, I would love to hear them from you. Just leave them in the comments section below. And please, if you've made it to the end here, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I may be coming up on episode 200, but the video version of this podcast is brand new, and I could really use your help. And on your spiritual journey, may you ask questions, seek answers, and boldly go wherever the quest takes you. Thanks for joining us here today and being part of the SkyPilot Faith Quest community. This is a great place to ask questions you wouldn't feel comfortable or safe asking in other places. And remember, the sign of a strong faith, solid religion, or healthy spiritual journey is not certainty, but that you keep asking questions.